Alright, chapter 11. Mr. Goliakin grasped for breath as he flew as if on wings after his fast retreating enemy. He felt a terrible inner energy, but for all that, Mr. Goliakin had every reason to think that at that moment, even an ordinary mosquito, had it been able to exist in St. Petersburg at that time of year, could very easily broken him with one touch of its wing. What was more, he felt that he had gone downhill, grown utterly weak, and that he was being borne along by some completely strange alien force, that he himself wasn't walking at all. On the contrary, his legs were giving way and refused to obey them. However, it all might turn out for the best, whether for the best or not for the best, thought Mr. Goliakin, barely able to catch his breath from running so fast. It's a lost cause. Of that, there's not the slightest doubt that I'm done for, as we know. It's signed, settled, and sealed. In spite of this, it was as if our hero had risen from the dead, that he'd survived a battle and snatched victory when he managed to grab his enemy's overcoat just as the latter was putting one foot on the step of the drosky he had just hired. My dear sir, he shouted at length to the infamous Mr. Goliakin Jr., whom he had finally caught up with. My dear sir, I trust you will. No, please don't have any hopes on that score, Goliakin's callous enemy replied evasively, standing with one foot on the step of Droshky, doing his utmost to get over to the other side of the carriage, vainly waving the other foot in the air as he tried to keep his balance, and at the same time wrenched his overcoat from Goliakin Sr., who, for his part, was holding on to it with all strength nature had conferred on him. Yakov Petrovich, just 10 minutes. Forgive me, I haven't the time. You yourself must agree, Yakov Petrovich. Please, Yakov Petrovich, for God's sake, Yakov Petrovich. Let's have it out. Let's face up to it. Just 1 second, Yakov Petrovich. My dear fellow, I haven't time, Mr. Goliakin's falsely honorable enemy replied with ill-mannered familiarity, but in the guise of good-heartedness. Some other time, believe me, with all my heart and soul, but now, well, really, I honestly can't. Scoundrel, thought our hero. Yakov Petrovich, he exclaimed miserably. I have never been your enemy. Spiteful people have depicted me unfairly for my part. I'm ready. If you like, shall we, you and I, Yakov Petrovich, pop into this coffee house now, there with pure hearts, as you so rightly put it just now, and in straightforward, noble language. Here, into this coffee house, then everything will explain itself. That's it. Yakov Petrovich, then everything is bound to be explained of its own accord. Into this coffee house. Very well, sir. I have no objections. Let's drop in, my dear chap. Only on one condition. Only on one condition. That everything will explain itself of its own accord. So it's like this, so to speak, sweetie pie, said Mr. Goliakin Jr., getting out of the cab and shamelessly slapping our hero on the shoulder. You're such a good pal, you are. For you, Yakov Petrovich, I'm prepared to go down a side street, as you so rightly suggested at that time, Yakov Petrovich. You're such a real rogue, you are. You do just what you like with a man, continued Mr. Goliakin's false friend with a faint smile, hovering and turning around him. Nice. Far from the main streets, the coffee house that the two Mr. Goliakins entered happened at that moment to be completely empty. The moment they rang the bell, a rather plump German woman appeared at the counter. Mr. Goliakin Sr. and his unworthy enemy went through into the second room, where a puffy-faced urchin with close-cropped hair was fussing around the stove with a bundle of firewood, trying to resuscitate the fire that was about to go out. At Mr. Goliakin Jr.'s request, chocolate was served. She's a scrumptious dish, said Goliakin Jr., roguishly winking at Mr. Goliakin Sr. Our hero blushed and said nothing. Oh yes, do forgive me, I quite forgot. I know your taste. You and I, dear sir, are partial to little Frauleins, aren't we? You and I, Yakov Petrovich, my dearest honest soul, fancy nice Frauleins, who are not lacking in certain other attractions, however. We rent rooms from them, lead them morally astray, dedicate our hearts to them for their beer sup and milk sup, BIERSUPPE and MILCHSUPPE, and promise them different things in writing. That's what we do, you fabulas, you gay deceiver. While he was saying all this, Mr. Goliakin Jr., thus making an utterly futile but nonetheless crafty allusion to a certain person of the female sex, hovered around Mr. Goliakin, warmly smiling at him in a false show of cordiality and delight at their meeting here. But when he noticed that Mr. Goliakin Sr. was by no means so stupid or by no means so completely lacking in education and refinement as immediately to trust him, the infamous man decided to change tactics and be open about everything. So after those vile remarks, the spurious Mr. Goliakin concluded by slapping the respectful Mr. Goliakin on the shoulder with deeply distressing effrontery and a familiarity, and, not contenting himself with this, started teasing him in a manner quite improper in well-bred society. He suddenly hit upon the idea of repeating his earlier filthy trick, that is, of pinching the exasperated Mr. Golyakin Sr. on the cheek despite the distress, Mr. Golyakin Sr.'s resistance, and faint cries of protest. At the sight of such depravity, our hero flew into a rage but held his tongue, only for the time being, however. "That's what my enemies say," he finally replied in a quavering voice, sensibly restraining himself. At the same time, our hero uneasily looked around at the door. Mr. Golyakin Jr. was evidently in excellent spirits and ready to embark on all kinds of pranks. Impermissible in a public place, and generally speaking, not tolerated by the rules of etiquette, especially as observed in society of the utmost refined tone. "Oh, well, just as you please," gravely responded Mr. Golyakin Jr. to Mr. Golyakin Sr.'s Mr. Sr.'s idea of putting his empty cup that he had drained with unseemly greed down on the table. "Well, now, there's no point in my staying long with you, but, well, how are you getting on now, Yakov Petrovich?" "There's only one thing I have to tell you, Yakov Petrovich," our hero replied coolly and with dignity. "I've never been your enemy." And what about Petrushka? That's his name, isn't it?" "Of course it is. How is he, all right? Same as ever?" "He's the same as ever, too, Yakov Petrovich," replied Mr. Golyakin Sr., somewhat startled. "I don't know, Yakov Petrovich. For my part, from an honorable and frank point of view, Yakov Petrovich, you yourself will agree, Yakov Petrovich." "Yes, sir, but you yourself know, Yakov Petrovich," replied Mr. Golyakin Jr. in a soft and expressive voice, thus falsely making himself out to be a man dejected, remorseful, and worthy of compassion. "You yourself know that these are hard times. I refer to you, Yakov Petrovich. You're an intelligent man. You'll make a fair judgment," added Mr. Golyakin Jr., basically flattering Mr. Golyakin Sr. "Life isn't a game, you know that yourself," concluded Mr. Golyakin Jr., meaningly, thus trying to pass himself off as a learned and intelligent man capable of conversing on lofty subjects. "For my part, Yakov Petrovich," our hero answered with animation, "as one who despises beating about the bush, and who speaks boldly and openly in straightforward, noble language, thus putting the whole business on a lofty basis, I can tell you, I can affirm candidly and honorably, Yakov Petrovich, that I am completely innocent, and that, as you yourself know, Yakov Petrovich, there can be mutual understandings, anything can happen, the judgment of society, the opinion of the servile mob. Telling you, quite frankly, Yakov Petrovich, anything can happen, and I'll say more, Yakov Petrovich. If you judge things like that, if you consider the business from a noble and lofty point of view, then I boldly maintain, I shall say this without any false shame, Yakov Petrovich, that it would be even a pleasure for me to discover I was mistaken, and even a pleasure to confess it. You yourself know you're an intelligent man and high-minded into the bargain. Without shame, without a false shame, I'm ready to confess it." Our hero concluded with nobility and dignity. "It's fate, it's destiny, Yakov Petrovich, but let's leave it at that," sighed Mr. Golyakin Jr. "Let's rather spend these brief moments together in more profitable and agreeable conversation, as is profitable between two colleagues. Really, I don't think I managed to say 2 words to you all this time, but I'm not the one to blame for it, Yakov Petrovich." "Nor am I," our hero heatedly interrupted. "Nor am I. My heart tells me I'm not the one to blame for all this. We must blame it all on fate, Yakov Petrovich," added Mr. Golyakin Sr. in a positively conciliatory tone. His voice was gradually beginning to weaken and quaver. "So how about your health in general?" the errant one inquired in a sugary voice. "I've a bit of a cough," our hero replied in an uneven, more sugary voice. "You must be careful with all these infections going around. You can easily catch quinsy, and I admit I've already started wrapping myself in flannel." "Oh yes, Yakov Petrovich, you can easily catch quinsy, Yakov Petrovich," our hero said after a brief silence. "Yakov Petrovich, I can see that I was mistaken. With deep emotion I recall those happy moments we spent together beneath my humble, dare I say, hospitable roof. But that's not what you wrote in your letter," somewhat scornfully retorted the completely justified Mr. Golyakin Jr., but only in the respect was he completely justified. "Yakov Petrovich, I was mistaken. Now I can clearly see that I was wrong to write that unfortunate letter of mine. Yakov Petrovich, I feel ashamed to look at you. You won't believe." "I'll give me that letter so I can tear it up before your eyes, Yakov Petrovich, or if that's really out of the question, I beg you to read it the other way around, completely the other way around, that is, with a deliberately friendly intention, given all the words their opposite meaning. I was in the wrong. Please forgive me, Yakov Petrovich. I was grievously wrong, Yakov Petrovich." "You were saying," Mr. Golyakin Sr.'s perfidious friend suddenly asked, quite nonchalantly and absent-mindedly. "I was saying that I was mistaken, Yakov Petrovich, and for my part it was completely without false shame." "Oh, wow, that's good. It's very good that you were mistaken," you rudely replied Mr. Golyakin Jr. I even had the idea, Yakov Petrovich nobly added, our candid hero, completely failing to notice his deceitful friend's appalling perfidy. I even had the idea that here two identical twins had been created. Ah, so that's your idea. Here's a notoriously worthless Mr. Goliakin Jr. rose and picked up his hat. Still failing to notice the deceit, Mr. Goliakin Sr. got up too, smiling ingenuously and good-naturedly at his spurious friend and attempting in his innocence to be nice and encouraging to him, so striking up a new friendship with him. Farewell, Your Excellency, Mr. Goliakin Jr. suddenly shouted. Our hero shuddered, observing something almost Bacchic in his enemy's face, and simply in order to get rid of him, thrust two of his fingers into the degenerate's outstretched hand. But here Goliakin Jr.'s shamelessness exceeded all bounds, grabbing two fingers of Mr. Goliakin Sr.'s hand and first squeezing them, that worthless man decided there and then to repeat before his very eyes the shameless trick he had played on him that morning. It was more than flesh and blood could stand. It was already stuffing the handkerchief on which he had wiped his fingers into his pocket when Goliakin Sr. recovered and rushed after him into the next room where, true to his usual obnoxious habit, his uncompromising foe slipped away in a hurry. That he was standing at the counter as if nothing had happened, eating pies and, just like any virtuous gentleman, calmly exchanging pleasantries with the German proprietress. Not in front of a lady, thought our hero, and he too went up to the counter, beside himself with agitation. Really not a bad little dish at all. What do you think? Said Mr. Goliakin Jr., embarking on those lewd sallies of his again, and no doubt counting on Mr. Goliakin Sr.'s infinite patience. For her part, the fat German looked at both her customers with blank, pewtery eyes, smiling affably since she evidently didn't understand a word of Russian. At these words of the utterly shameless Mr. Goliakin Jr., our hero flushed as a red fire, losing all self-control, finally launched himself at him with the clear intention of tearing him limb from limb and thus finishing him for good. But Mr. Goliakin Jr., with his customary vileness, was far off by now. He had taken to his heels and was already outside the front door and on the top steps. It goes without saying that after the first momentary fit of stupefaction that had naturally come over Mr. Goliakin Sr., he dashed full tilt after the offender, who was already getting into the cab that had been waiting for him and with whose driver he obviously had an agreement. But at that very moment, the fat German, seeing that her two customers were fleeing, shrieked and rang her bell as hard as she could. Almost in mid-air, our hero turned around, threw her some money, both for himself and for the shameless man who had not paid, and without asking for change, and despite the delay, this occasion still managed, although again almost in mid-air, to catch up with his enemy, clinging to the splashboard with all strength bestowed on him by nature. Our hero was carried some way along the street as he attempted to clamber on to the carriage, while Mr. Goliakin Jr. did his level best to fend him off. Meanwhile, the driver, with whip, reins, feet, and exhortations, urged on his broken-down nag, which, quite unexpectedly, the bit between its teeth broke into a gallop, kicking out its hind legs, a nasty habit it had, at every third stride. Finally, our hero managed to perch himself on the drosky, facing his enemy, leaning with his back to the driver, his knees pressed. His knees pressed against his enemy's hand, and with his right hand gripping for all it was worth the badly moth-eaten fur collar of his depraved and fiercest enemy's coat. The two enemies were carried along for some time in silence. Our hero could barely catch his breath. The road was dreadful, and he kept bobbing up and down at every stride, in great danger of breaking his neck. What was more, his fierce enemy still would not concede defeat and was trying to tip his opponent over into the mud. The crowning nastiness was the frightful weather. The snow was falling in large flakes, which were doing their utmost for their part to creep somehow under the unbuttoned coat of the genuine Mr. Goliakin. All around it was murky, difficult to see anything and to tell where they were going, and along with the streets. It struck Mr. Goliakin that there was something familiar about what was happening to him. For a moment he tried to remember whether he had had a kind of hunch the day before, in a dream, for example. Finally his misery turned to the most acute agony. Leaning with all his weight against his pitiless enemy, he was about to utter a cry, but his cry died upon his lips. There was a moment when Mr. Goliakin forgot everything and decided that everything was all right, that it was all simply happening in some inexplicable way, and that in this case it would have been superfluous to protest a complete lost cause. But suddenly, and almost at the moment when our hero was coming to his conclusion, a careless jolt changed the whole complexion of the matter. Mr. Goliakin toppled off the drosky like a sack of flour and rolled away somewhere, admitting to himself as he fell, and quite rightly, that in fact he had let himself get excited most inopportunely. Finally leaping, he saw that they arrived somewhere. The drosky was standing in the middle of a courtyard, and at first glance our hero recognized it as belonging to the very same house in which old Sofia Ivanovich resided. In that very moment he noticed that his enemy was already going up on the porch. Probably he was going to visit old Sofia Ivanovich, and in indescribable anguish he was about to dash off and overtake his foe, but fortunately for him he prudently had second thoughts. Not forgetting to pay the driver, Mr. Goliakin tore down the street for all he was worth, wherever his legs would carry him. As before, the snow was falling heavily, and it was wet, murky, dark. Our hero did not run, but flew, knocking over everyone in his path, men, women, children, and in turn rebounded from men, women, and children. All around and from behind could be heard cries of distress, shrieks, and screams, but Mr. Goliakin seemed oblivious of it all and did not deign to pay attention to any of it. But at Semyonovsky Bridge, he came to his senses, and only then, as a result of somehow managing to collide awkwardly with two peasant women, knocking them over together with their wares, and then toppling over himself. It's all right, thought Mr. Goliakin. All this can very easily be settled for the best. And immediately he felt in his pocket for a silver ruble to pay for this built gingerbread, apples, peas, and sundry items. Suddenly a new light dawned on Mr. Goliakin. In his pocket he found the letter given by him by the clerk that morning. Happening to remember that not far away was a tavern he knew, he ran into it without wasting a moment and settling himself at a small table lit by a tallow candle. Without paying attention to anything, without listening to the waiter who had come to take his order, he broke the seal and read the following, which completely stunned him. Noble one who was suffering on my behalf and who is eternally dear to my heart. I am suffering, I am perishing, save me. A slanderer, an intriguer, notorious for his worthless ways, has ensnared me, and I am undone. I am fallen, to me is abhorrent, while you that have kept us apart. My letters to you have been intercepted, and it's all the work of an immoral one, taking advantage of his only good quality, his resemblance to you. In any event, one can be ugly but still charmed with intellect, powerful feelings, and pleasant manners. I am perishing. I am to be married against my will, and the one who was intriguing most is my father, my benefactor, state counselor, Sofia Ivanovich, doubtless wishing to usurp my place and relations in good society. But my mind is made up, and I protest with all the powers that nature has given me. Wait for me in your carriage outside Sofia Ivanovich's window exactly at 9 tonight. We're giving another ball, and that handsome lieutenant is coming again. I shall come out, and we shall fly away. Besides, there are other places where no one can still be of service to one's country. At any rate, my friend, remember that innocence is strong by virtue of its very innocence. Farewell. Wait at the entrance with the carriage. I shall throw myself into the shelter of your embrace at 2 o'clock in the morning. Yours to the grave, Clara Osovievna. After reading this letter, our hero remained for some time as if thunderstruck. In terrible distress and terrible agitation, white as a sheet, he paced the room several times with the letter in his hand. To crown all this appalling tribulations, our hero failed to notice that at that moment he was object of the exclusive attention of everyone in the room. Probably disorder clothes in his uncontrollable agitation, his walking, rather his scurrying, his two-handed gesticulations, and perhaps several enigmatic words spoken down the wind in absent-mindedness. All this must have been lowered Mr. Goliakin significantly in the opinion of all present. Even the waiter was beginning to look at him suspiciously. When he came to his senses, our hero found he was standing in the middle of the room, staring in an almost improper, discourteous manner at one old gentleman of the most venerable appearance who, having dined and set a prayer before an icon, had returned to his seat, and for his part couldn't take his eyes off Goliakin. Our hero gazed vacantly around and noticed that everyone there, every single person who was looking at him with the most ominous and suspicious expression. Suddenly, a retired military man with a red collar, loudly demanded, "The Police Gazette." Mr. Goliakin started and blushed. Happening to look down, he saw that his clothing was so unseemly that it was not fit to be worn even in his own home, let alone in a public place. His boots, trousers, and the whole of his left side were completely caked with mud. His right trouser strap was torn off, and his tailcoat even torn in many places. In inexhaustible distress, our hero went over to the table where he had read the letter and saw that the waiter was approaching with a strange and insolently insistent expression on his face. Oh, that's my guy. Somebody flustered and quite deflated, our hero set about inspecting the tablet at which he was now standing. On it lay plates yet to be cleared away from someone's dinner, a soiled napkin, and a knife, fork, and spoon that had just been used. Who can have been dining here, our hero wondered. Could it have been me? Anything is possible. I must have had dinner and didn't even notice. What on earth shall I do now? Looking up, Mr. Goliakin saw that the waiter was again beside him and about to say something to him. "How much do I owe you, old chap?" our hero asked in a trembling voice. Loud laughter broke out all around Mr. Goliakin. Even the waiter himself grinned. Mr. Goliakin understood that he had blundered again, committed some awful gaffe. Realizing all this, he was so embarrassed that he felt compelled to grope in his pocket for his handkerchief, probably for the sake of doing something instead of simply standing there. But to his own and everyone else's indescribable amazement, instead of his handkerchief, he pulled out the phial, Phial, containing some kind of medicine prescribed 4 days earlier by Christian Ivanovich. Get it at the same chemist as before, ran through Goliakin's mind. Suddenly he gave a start and almost shrieked with horror. A new light was dawning. The dark, revolting, reddish liquid shone into Goliakin's eyes with a sinister gleam. The bottle dropped from his grasp and immediately shattered on the floor. Our hero screamed and jumped back from the spilt liquid. He was trembling in every limb, and beds of sweat broke out on his temples and forehead. So my life is in danger, he said. Meanwhile, there was an uproar and general commotion in the room. Everyone surrounded Mr. Golyakin. Everyone spoke to Mr. Golyakin. Some even grabbed hold of Mr. Golyakin. But our hero was speechless, emotionless, seeing nothing, hearing nothing, feeling nothing. Finally, as if tearing off, he rushed out of the tavern, pushing aside each and every one of those who were endeavoring to detain him, slumped almost unconscious into My hero was speechless and motionless, seeing nothing, hearing nothing, feeling nothing. Finally, as if tearing off, he rushed out of the tavern, pushing aside each and every one of those who were endeavoring to detain him, slumped almost unconscious into the first drosky. Slumped almost unconscious into the first droshky that happened to come along and sped off to his flat. In the entrance hall, he met Mikhayev, yet the office porter bearing an official envelope in his hand. "I know, my friend, I know everything. It's official," our exhausted hero replied in a weak, suffering voice, and in fact, the envelope contained an order to Mr. Golyakin, signed by Andrei Filipovich, for him to hand over all the files in his possession to Ivan Semyonovich. After taking the envelope and giving the porter 10 kopecks, Mr. Golyakin entered his flat and found Petrushka getting all his things together, all his rubbish and bits and pieces and worldly possessions, with the clear intention of abandoning Mr. Golyakin, going over to Carolina Ivanovna, who had enticed him there as a replacement for Yustafi. So his maid is getting his own stuff together. That's the end of chapter 11.